A quick word of warning. This episode contains discussions of drugs, addiction, mental health, childhood trauma, adoption, racism and misogyny, domestic abuse, as well as a drug overdose and drowning that sadly ended Brian's life. There will be resources in the show notes for you to check out if you are affected by any of the issues we've discussed today. Hello and welcome to Empathy for the Devil. I'm Sam Parker.
I'm Matt Thomas.
I'm Chula Gunawardena.
In every episode, we're going to be diving into the lives of individuals in the spotlight who left us too soon, but may still face harsh judgments for how they lived, what they became, or how they died.
Join us as we peel back the layers of their stories with empathy and understanding, exploring their journeys from mortals to myths from a modern mental health perspective, aiming to understand the person behind the legend.
We want to bring empathy to the misunderstood, misjudged, or even demonised. Empathy for the devil.
Hello and welcome to our first episode of Empathy for the Devil. So guys, how are you feeling?
Oh, really excited.
Yeah.
We've been waiting for this for a while, haven't we?
We have.
So maybe we should start by saying a bit about us.
Yeah.
So Matt, Sam, Chula, we run a company called Attune. We deliver mental health and wellbeing services to music, entertainment and sport. My background is music industry. I used to be an artist manager, and then I trained as a counsellor and a coach, and I've got lots of recovery personal history going on, which has run alongside my entire music industry career. And I wanted to work with these two guys because A, I love them. B, I've got a massive amount of respect for them. Not that I show it on a daily basis. Matt will be testament to that.
Yep.
And we love what we do. And we really thought that actually putting this podcast together and actually bringing our conversations together that we have pretty much on a daily basis might be interesting and informative for people to listen to.
Yeah, absolutely. My name's Chula. I'm the clinical director of Attune and I'm a psychotherapist. I was a musician in my 20s and unfortunately that was brought to a premature end by addiction, heroin addiction, and then ended up in rehab in 2003. And following that, came into the field, worked in the statutory sector and on the front line, and then came into the charity and private sector and met you guys at a conference that, Matt, you were running.
I was.
And we started working together for the music support charity and then pulled together Attune.
Yeah, and here we are.
Yeah.
And that actually reminds me, Matt, so you've got a background in music industry and the addiction recovery field.
I do, absolutely. So my story was that, and still is, that I worked in the music industry in record labels and management for a long time. And during that time, I suffered very badly from addiction, other mental health issues, and then, as it turns out, ADHD as well. And very fortunately, I got into recovery in 2006 and found that the music industry back then was not a great place for someone to be in recovery. In the same way that it was quite an enabling place for someone.
What a fucking good place for somebody who is in active addiction.
It's great if you're in active addiction. But not so great if you're trying to get into recovery. Yeah. And so I kind of had a field switch, and now poacher turned gamekeeper, if you like. And now I am a holistic coaching practitioner. I founded the charity Music Support. I rather co-founded it. I can't take the credit. With great people such as yourself, Sam, and got to meet Chula. And I've been working in this field now for about 10 years, and I'm just really passionate about bringing the message that recovery is an option and people who are suffering with addiction or mental health issues aren't necessarily the sum of their behaviours.
Yeah.
So in our first episode, I'm going to be taking the lead, telling you the story of a musician I have been fascinated by, both personally and professionally, for a long time. And I'm talking, of course, about Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones.
Yes.
So we all know about Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, Charlie Watts, Bill Wyman, even Ronnie Wood. Brian Jones is too often forgotten. And just as a reminder, a first-time introduction, Brian Jones is actually the guy who brought the Rolling Stones together in the first place, way back in 1962. But he suffered a lot with things like addiction and mental health issues. And his behaviour and his emotional turmoil did ultimately isolate him from the band. And he very sadly died in 1969, having just been kicked out of the band when they were really reaching their dizzy heights.
And what was it about Brian Jones's story that you felt that you wanted to bring him as our first little soul person that we wanted to look at?
Good question. And I think in a lot of cases, it's the misunderstanding.
Right.
It's the misunderstanding of his behaviour and his symptoms that had him painted as a bad guy, as a hedonist, as a pain in the arse, as he was quite often described. And I like to think that we can see beyond that. And that's kind of what Empathy for the Devil's all about. It's about seeing beyond what happened and looking at maybe some of the reasons why it happened. That was very close to my story because, you know, like a lot of people in active addiction and with mental health issues, you know, I perhaps behaved like a bit of a cock at times, or, you know, maybe even, you know, a bit more than a bit of a cock at times. And, you know, I've been kicked out of places. I've been kicked out of record labels. I've been kicked out of countries, you know, and it's like, but I'm not actually a bad guy.
Yeah.
You know, I was someone in active addiction with complex needs and complex mental health issues that was treated as a bad guy. And in a lot of cases, that often exacerbates it.
Yeah, I can completely identify with that, and I become a different person when I use drugs. I really do a lot of things that I would never think of even doing in my recovery, but that's who I was for many years, and that's who people thought I was, and actually, it wasn't me at all.
Exactly. And, you know, and that's one of the things that we're aiming to do here. And obviously, Brian was a really complex guy, and he was a big mixture of dark and light and charm and unkindness, and a combination of joy and chaos. He was greatly loved and also deeply hated. But like I said, I think he was misunderstood. And that's what we're going to delve into.
Actually, Matt, before we crack on with Brian's story, I thought it would be really nice to kind of light a candle, because there's kind of a real sense, I think, that we need to hold some space, and then we can leave Brian's story and all that we've learned in this sort of container, if you like.
Idea. Let's light a candle.
So, this is for you, Brian. Holding you with compassion and respect.
And empathy. Brilliant.
Thanks, Sam.
So, in talking about Brian's story, we're really talking about two separate things that were intertwined, which is his personal life and his mental health issues and his addiction, and also his identity as a performer. And this is something that I believe we're going to come back to time and time again in this podcast.
Identity.
Yeah.
In particular,
Identity. And while I was doing my research, I came across this amazing essay that was written by Lou Reed in 1972, after he'd left the Velvet Underground and before he launched on a solo career. And it was an essay for a book called No One Waved Goodbye, a casualty report on rock and roll.
Fucking hell.
And what inspired that was the spate of deaths in the late 60s and early 70s of people in rock and roll. And the first thing that Lou Reed said was, and I'm going to read the quote in full actually, because it's really important.
Yeah, do it.
At the age when identity is a problem, some people join rock and roll bands and perform for other people who share the same difficulties. The age difference between performer and beholder in rock is not large, but unfortunately, those in the fourth tier assume those on stage know something they don't, which is not true. It simply requires a very secure ego to allow yourself to be loved for what you do rather than who you are, and an even larger one to realize you are what you do. The singer has a soul, but feels he isn't loved off stage, or perhaps worse, feels he shines only on stage, and off is wilted, a shell as common as the garden gardenia. But we are all common as snowflakes, aren't we?
Fucking hell.
Yeah.
Lou Reed.
And he went on to say, performer beware, if you come looking for love, come prepared with a thick skin or a thick heart, and don't depend on anyone.
It's interesting you should say that, actually, and that's such an amazing quote. is that when I was researching George Michael, which we'll do later on in the season, he was talking about about the age of becoming famous, and I can't quote it verbatim, sadly, but along the lines of, if you haven't got a good sense of yourself by the time you become famous, you're fucked.
Yeah.
To summarise, obviously.
Yeah. And so, on to Brian Jones.
Yeah.
So the story begins, as Damon Albarn once said. So Brian Jones was... Come on, you're meant to laugh.
Sorry. I sort of chuckled a little bit.
So Brian was born, Lewis Brian Jones, in February 1942 in Cheltenham, Gloucestershire. He was the second child of Lewis and Louisa. He had an older sister, Pamela, who sadly died in 1945 as a baby, and a younger sister who was born in 1946. They were they were quite a typical family at the time, strict, quite dour. It was post-war. And it was the rationing mindset. It was the culture of the 50s and 60s. Brian's relationship with his dad was quite difficult. He was a disciplinarian. The mum was very rigid. There wasn't much fun and laughter, apparently. Paul Trinker, who wrote one of the many books I've read, describes his upbringing as affection-free. And that might well have affected Brian's relationship style in later life.
Absolutely.
And, in the wider culture, abortion was still illegal. Homosexuals were imprisoned. And the charts musically was full of crooners and big bands.
Fucking hell.
Which is just quite...
It's just crazy, isn't it? That it's not that long ago and it was so different.
Exactly. Yeah. But let's talk about the musical environment, because, as I've said, that it was crooners and big bands mostly. Brian's mum played piano and organ in the church choir. She was also a piano teacher. And so when Brian started to discover the blues, this was something that was not particularly approved of by his parents.
And how would he have done that in Cheltenham?
Well, record shops. Right. Weirdly, there was a burgeoning jazz scene in Cheltenham, but that was Brian's introduction to music. Yeah. And by the age of 15, he was scouting around these record shops, listening mostly to jazz music, and through jazz, he discovered the blues. And this was really where the obsession kicked in. And he was listening to people like Elmore James, and Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf, and of course the mysterious Robert Johnson. And on his 17th birthday, Brian got a guitar, and this gift was pivotal. He'd already been kind of strumming along trying to figure out songs, and like I said, his parents hated this. They thought it represented, it was the devil's music. There was a racial undertone, there was a lifestyle undertone. It was considered degraded, it was considered morally and ethically wrong. And so they tried to
fucking loved it.
Exactly. I mean, that's exactly what happened. And systemically, Brian was part of that first generation that really did rebel.
Yeah.
So Brian's school life wasn't brilliant, it has to be said. It started off quite well, but as the same thing that happened to me in my adolescence, he ended up going off the rails and being kicked out of 2 schools.
So he's quite a troublesome kid then.
Yeah.
And do you think that was him acting out the tragedy in the family?
Well, let's have a look at his opening hand, because the sister died when the sister Pamela died when he was 3, and it was never spoken about in the family.
Yeah.
And in fact, he once told a babysitter about his sister and showed her pictures, and the babysitter said that she really thought he felt the need to talk about it.
Oh wow.
Okay. I mean, what effect is that unexpressed grief going to be having, on the entire family, I suppose, but particularly for the child?
Well,
Brian,
the problem in a family where there's tragedy of, I think, any kind, is that if people aren't willing to really embrace the experience and express what they're going through, then all those feelings get suppressed and they have to go somewhere. And more often than not, one member of that family might become the vessel for all of that systemic disturbance, and then they start acting out all the emotions. It's not uncommon, and if you look at addicts' families, you often find that there was something going on in their childhood that people weren't willing to acknowledge for some reason.
But as the surviving child, the first surviving child, I'm imagining that's going to bring a lot of responsibility, as you've just said, but also kind of the idea of, I mean, it must be terrifying for a sibling to die who's older than you.
Yeah.
Because it's like, what?
And then get this, his parents told him that if he didn't behave, he would be sent to the same place that Pamela had gone.
Oh no, that's terrible.
Fucking God.
Yeah, that must have been terrifying for him.
Absolutely.
So not only is it unacknowledged, but this whole death business means that you go away somewhere awful.
Yeah.
And you never come back.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, alongside this, he was really badly asthmatic, which had a massive effect on his schooling because, you know, people with asthma don't get to join the sports teams.
Right.
And then so they automatically
so you just sat on the
feel
side.
excluded. Yeah.
And all the cool kids are sort of knocking around doing this, that and the other.
Exactly.
And you look,
By the time he gets to his adolescence, he's just full of difficult feelings, I imagine. So he'd be looking for somewhere to put that.
Yeah. And he put it into the blues.
Yeah.
And it led to the birth of the Rolling Stones.
Yeah.
I can absolutely relate to that. I think if I hadn't found music when I was young, I don't know what would have happened to me. Yes, I did start smoking and drinking at the same time, but I think music really gave me an outlet for all the emotions that I couldn't carry or felt I couldn't carry.
But it's also really just thinking about honouring Brian actually and lighting that candle. What a gift he gave to the kids like you and, you know, all of those other young people that felt like they needed to connect to something.
And so going back to Brian and the trauma of the loss of his sister and everything that came with that, I think giving up babies is going to become a big theme in his life. So something that you guys may not know is that Brian actually fathered five babies in his early years, kind of like, you know, between 17 and 22 or 23. Absolutely, obviously out of wedlock because he wasn't married.
All
Different mothers.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Yeah. And so there was something going on there that there were a lot of unplanned pregnancies.
It's almost like a desire to create life, isn't it? Almost a compulsion.
Yeah, an unconscious reenactment.
Yeah. To sort of smash through the death.
And one of the points is that they were all taken away from him in one way or another. Some were given up for adoption, some were brought up by their mothers, some he tried to be a family unit with and for various reasons, including at one stage being told by their manager that it wasn't a good look for the band. Didn't work out.
Okay.
So whilst he's almost trying to heal his trauma by recreating his sister or bringing his sister back, unfortunately what he does is he compounds the trauma by then having the loss repeated over and over and over again.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? When trauma's unconscious, it does drive our behaviour without us realising it.
Yeah.
And it's only through becoming conscious of what's happened to us and what our personal story is that actually we can get some kind of awareness and then control or choice.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing is that this led to a lot of disgrace for Brian. There was a lot of shame and disgrace for him and his family.
But his mum and dad were fucking horrified, weren't they?
Well, in 1959, one day Brian, age 17, came home to find his bags packed on the doorstep.
I bet.
Yeah, so that's how they felt. A clear indication they'd had enough. And very metaphorical for Brian because there were to be other times in his life where he, metaphorically speaking, had his bags packed. Yeah.
So there's rejection on top of what he's already carrying.
Yeah. And so, he didn't so much move away as ran away. With a slightly tattered reputation, but then he picked it all up again in London, and there was this amazing scene in London in the early 60s of jazz, R&B, electric blues, whatever you want to call it. Brian called it electric blues, and he was convinced it was going to be massive. Most of his peers thought it was going to be niche, but he just had this feeling, and so he was one of those pioneers. Which led to the formation of the Rolling Stones in 1962.
Wow. And how did he advertise or how did he find other band members?
He put an ad in the paper.
Did he?
Yeah.
Do we know which one?
He put an ad in the paper. I think it was NME.
It was the NME, was it?
I think it was. I could be wrong, but I think it was NME.
Old school.
And kind of the centre of this scene, weirdly, there was a pub in Soho and a pub in Richmond, and they were the two centres of their scene.
What Soho pub?
It was called the Bricklayer's Arms.
Oh, right, okay.
And Brian had a rehearsal space there. And
So
it
fucking
just
cool.
so happened that one day Mick and Keith, who we knew already, but they turned up.
From going out and about?
Exactly.
Right.
And they came together and they started playing. And, eventually, a little bit later, actually, Charlie Watts and Bill Wyman joined.
So 2 guitars at that point.
Yeah.
Mick, Charlie drums, joins.
Yeah.
Bass?
Bill Wyman.
Oh, he joined
Yep.
more or less at the start?
Yep.
Okay.
And the story goes that one day a band had dropped out of a gig at the Marquee that was like the Marquee in Soho, where we've all been,
place. Yeah.
And that was another centre for this scene, this burgeoning scene. And a band dropped out. And so Brian, who was quite well known on the scene, got a call from
Probably
the booker.
knew the promoter,
Said, can your band play tonight?
Yeah.
And he was like, yeah. And he was like, what are you called?
Yeah.
And he was like, and he looked on the floor and there was one of his Muddy Waters album. And the title of the song was something to do with a Rolling Stone. And so he just said, we're called the Rolling Stones.
Oh, fucking hell. They didn't even have a name.
That's how the name came about.
That's incredible. I love that.
And one thing led to another. And then Brian, Mick and Keith moved into this really fucking mucky flat in Edith Grove in Chelsea that almost became like the unofficial centre of this whole scene.
Oh my God.
And, they were it was very squalid. But they were living like brothers, friends, musicians. Brian was a real driving force here. This very much became Brian's family of choice.
Yeah.
And how old are we talking? Late teens, early 20s?
Oh, yeah. We're talking kind of 18, 19, round about now.
Sounds incredible.
Yeah, that would have been great.
Can you imagine?
Yeah.
And if you think about it from Brian's perspective, he'd lost his sister. He'd lost his parents effectively, and now he'd found this band of brothers, literally, that all shared the same interest, all shared the same passions, and it must have just really been quite an incredible existence.
How exciting, how lovely to be with other people who share what you love, and that, that's why Friends is so popular, the TV show, isn't it? It's that point where, you leave home, you go to university and you sort of find your family of choice.
Your tribe.
As it were, your tribe,
You find your tribe,
yeah.
Absolutely. But unfortunately, you do bring the issues that you had in your family of origin with you into your family of choice.
Oh yeah, kicking and screaming.
So all was not well.
No.
And kind of from 1962, when the band first started in the Bricklayer's Arms and that gig in the Marquee, he really did act as the manager. He booked the gigs. He organised the transport.
He was the leader.
He was the leader. He chose the songs. He showed the others kind of how to play.
Right.
All of that. And the buzz started happening, and someone tipped off a young gentleman called Andrew Loog Oldham. He had worked very briefly for Brian Epstein. Andrew Loog Oldham. So he knew what was what. He knew that people were dispensable.
Yeah.
He knew about image making.
Teenage market.
Teenage market.
Teenage
for anyone who doesn't know, Brian Epstein was the manager of the Beatles.
Yeah.
And actually, there's a great quote from Andrew Loog Oldham. It says, Brian Jones was put here to form the Rolling Stones, and I was put here to uncover and launch them. The rest is detail and what you make of it. I was given a bonus. I got to live another day. And that we know that's something that Brian didn't get to live another day. But that comes a bit later.
I'm not loving that
story.
statement.
No. I don't think that there's much to love in that statement.
No. There's a real sort of sense of being discarded. It's like, oh yeah, you did that, but actually, you're kind of not needed now. And we see that so much in the music industry, don't we? Any fucking creative industry. It's so brutal, isn't it?
Yeah. And what you just said, Sam, probably sums up exactly how Brian Jones was feeling. And that, because he'd sort of invented the Rolling Stones, if you like, to be this electric blues band that they were doing very, very well at. And Andrew Loog Oldham immediately wanted to move things into the pop-oriented world and not just copy the Beatles, but actually become the anti-Beatles. Brian wanted R&B, Andrew Loog Oldham wanted pop. So it's kind of like they were always at loggerheads. And by 1963, the classic lineup of the Stones was happening. I failed to mention earlier on, actually, that there was someone called Ian Stewart who was in that very early lineup, who was very, very important to it. And he was probably Brian Jones's biggest ally. But his face didn't fit. And it also made 6, not 5, so there were financial implications. And the decision was taken to boot Ian Stewart out of the band in 1963. And at the same time, they decided to add a G to Rolling Stones. So the Rolling Stones became the Rolling Stones, and Brian lost control.
It's funny, isn't it? Because there's a real sort of subtle shift between having the G and not having the G, isn't there? And it sort of stamps a sort of an intent, doesn't it? That this is going to be pop. It's almost like it's the classic crossroads, isn't it? Do you go for integrity, let's say, and artistic alignment with what you are about, or do you, I want to say,
commercial success,
the devil's cock, but that's a bit much, isn't it? Yeah. But yeah, I mean, but in doing so, I guess the point is that you are going to fundamentally lose something.
Yeah.
You're going to lose something.
Absolutely.
And it might be your fucking life, actually.
I think musically it was really important that Brian was there pulling it in that blues direction. Can you imagine if he hadn't been there at all and they'd become sort
it would have been a load
complete
of
pop?
Yeah,
well, I wasn't going to say that.
It would never have happened.
No, it wouldn't have happened. And also, if you don't have an integral centre point of what you're doing, people the people will smell it a fucking mile off.
So, and then success came really quickly, basically. And I'm not going to go into a deep history of the Rolling Stones releases, but they became very big very quickly in the years between 1963, 1964, 1965, as a lot of bands do. And there were a tumultuous 5 years during which, you know, there was a lot of tension, and the really strong rift started to happen. And for Brian, this was everything he'd ever dreamed of packaged into his biggest nightmare. Because it was kind of like, you know, he got to do it, but it wasn't on his terms. So you can kind of imagine that he was getting more and more dissatisfied and more disenfranchised.
So he felt compromised.
You know, and but this is big. So in about it was after a few years that the band found out that Brian had been taking an extra £5 for his management duties, even after Andrew Loog Oldham came into the picture.
Okay.
So
he was in charge of finances, was he?
Well, no, he wasn't, but he was just being paid an extra £5.
Right.
When he was in charge, he just took it. But then, you know, when Andrew and his partner came in, he was paid it.
So Brian was a very naughty boy.
Well, I mean, you know, you might well say that, but the rest of the band certainly thought that.
I was going to say, did that
particularly Mick and Keith
pissed off?
And you know, it was seen as a betrayal. It was seen as theft. It was seen as dishonesty. It apparently led to punch-ups. There was one famous punch-up between Keith and Brian, but it also led to Brian's initial ostracization from the band, because they were able to be incredibly cruel, and so they do things like leave him behind, you know, not give him a lift to the next gig, him make his own way there, eat in different restaurants, eat his food, you know, in the rider. Bill Wyman described it very regretfully as him being exiled. So it's kind of like he was being exiled while he was in the band. You know, I know how awful that is. I was once exiled when I was at boarding school. The rest of my dorm didn't talk to me for a 2-month period. So I was coming in and out of the dorm, and they just wouldn't talk to me. They wouldn't even acknowledge my presence. And it's fucking horrible.
It is, and that's it's a very scarring experience. I've actually worked with that, and it's something that can be very lasting in terms of someone's self-esteem can be damaged by that quite. And it's difficult to repair.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, and there is regret. The regret has been expressed by pretty much all of them, actually, about what happened there. And also it's important to tell the other side of the story. I mean, Brian was an exasperating person to be around. You know, he was unreliable. He was quite cruel himself. And he was also one of the most popular members of the band. So it's like, it must have been very
Did the
annoying
girls
to
like
them.
Brian?
Girls
He's
loved
very
Brian.
pretty boy,
He's
wasn't
gorgeous.
he? Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, they'd have been not only pissed off with him about the £5, pissed off with him about like being one of the most popular members, but also it all seemed so easy for him. You know, he was like an effortless guitar player. You know, so you do get the sense sometimes that Brian just turned up, you know, and did it, whereas the others had to really work for it.
And actually, just thinking about it as well, because we talked a little bit. I think you touched earlier on some neurodiversity.
Potentially, and we'll get to that.
Okay.
We'll get to that. You know, he did get sidelined, but quite slowly. And even while he was being sidelined, he was still this phenomenal multi-instrumentalist who kind of invented. He was a pioneer of this thing that is now called Baroque rock, which is just basically where people brought unusual instruments from the Baroque period into rock.
That definitely sounds up your own arse.
And but I mean, but they were all doing it. And you can hear it on, so even though he didn't write them, Brian's influence on songs like Ruby Tuesday, Paint It Black, Under My Thumb, She's a Rainbow, my personal favourite. Right up until, 1968, he was there. He was absolutely, categorically influential and a massive part of the Stones' sound. You know, at that time, he was very much the ringleader, and this also really irritated the others about him. But I tell you what to me is the most important point in the Stones' history was when in 1964 they got to record in Chess Studios, which was where all their heroes are recorded.
Right.
And they recorded a Muddy Waters cover, a song called I Can't Be Satisfied, that was like one of the blues classics. And it kind of, it was a real moment. Muddy Waters came to visit them in the studio even. And less than a year later, they went back to Chess Studios to record I Can't Get No Satisfaction. And so that kind of is a real watermark and symbolises for me the difference between Rolling Stones with an N and Rolling Stones with a G, when the kind of Muddy Waters classic got sidelined, if you like. And
so a muddy watermark.
And a muddy watermark, very good. And they ended up recording one of their biggest hits ever, Satisfaction, which of course Brian Jones hated. And it was around about this time when he said in an interview, my ultimate aim in life was never to be a pop star. I enjoy it with reservations, but I'm not really satisfied artistically or personally. The future as a Rolling Stone is very uncertain. That was in 1965.
Gosh.
So some of Brian's character traits were unreliable, disorganized, impulsive, oversensitive, prone to outbursts and compulsive behavior, with an incredible ability to hyper-focus on the things that he liked. And then he also self-medicates with drugs, alcohol, other compulsive behaviors. He missed deadlines, procrastinated, and could only concentrate on things that gave him dopamine, becoming obsessed and hyper-focused.
Sounds really familiar.
It does sound familiar, doesn't it? It sounds really, really familiar. That's you, innit? That is not only you, but that's also me.
Yeah.
And I think what I was imagining during the, when the taking the £5, being a bit purist, this kind of knowing how annoying it is for other people to deal with my ADHD stuff, like turning up late, not doing what I said I was going to do when I said I was going to do it, and that whole kind of struggle and compulsivity and vagueness and all the rest of it. It's really fucking annoying to be around, isn't it? I know how annoyed I get with you, for example, and no doubt you two get with me. But yeah, I mean, who knew then that that was even a thing?
But I'm not going to kick you out of the band, Sam.
Are you not kicking me out of the band?
Not yet. Not yet. So what we're saying is that it is possible that we can't diagnose him, but it is possible that Brian was suffering from some kind of neurodiversity, such as ADHD and the rejection sensitive dysphoria, which for those who don't know is a condition related to ADHD where you're just super sensitive to criticism, rejection, or even perceived criticism or rejection. And then of course, ADHD is self-medicated very often through the use of drugs and alcohol. And so we can't really talk about Brian Jones without talking about his massive use of drugs and alcohol.
Yeah.
Which I imagine at the time would have been masked because that's what everybody was doing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there is proof that there's a high proportion of people with neurodiverse issues in the addict population. And whether that's something that's linked to the illness itself, or whether it's that the addiction comes in order to self-regulate or contain the neurodiversity, I don't think we're really quite sure. And it could be a mixture of both.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a bit of further evidence as well. Is one of his really earliest friends always talks about Brian about never being satisfied, and that kind of state of chronic dissatisfaction is both evident in the pathology of ADHD as well as in addiction.
Yeah,
Always looking for the next new thing.
Exactly.
just can't get no.
Satisfaction.
Well, there you go. You know, it's back to the satisfaction. Absolutely. So now let's move towards Brian's later years, and we've talked about the themes of loss. We've talked about the themes of losing his babies. We've talked about the theme of losing control of the Rolling Stones, but also that dichotomy between the inner Brian and the outer Brian.
Yeah.
And, you know, let's complete the picture by talking about Anita Pallenberg. So Anita Pallenberg was probably the first it girl. She was a German-Italian actress and model who kind of summarized the spirit of the 1960s. She was gorgeous, beautiful, stylish. She had mystery. She had rebellion. She was also funny, intelligent, cultured, charismatic, very sexually liberated. Had
God bless her.
Outlandish appearance, both in her dress sense and her outward naughtiness. And in fact, there's an amazing documentary that's just come out that I've watched, and it's called Catching Fire. And it's great, and it really pays testimony to women like Anita Pallenberg and their cultural importance in the 60s.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because Anita Pallenberg, when I was, I don't know, you know, in my 20s, I guess, would be kind of like the start of like the ultimate groupie. You know, that's how I would have perceived her and other women that were knocking around, you know.
It's a good point.
But actually, you know, the fact that they were women probably does a lot to downgrade, underplay their cultural and creative input into
You're
the scenes.
right. Yeah.
I'm just thinking about Andy Warhol, you know, that whole kind of, you know, all of these scenes, really important cultural scenes that were going on along, you know, did obviously tend to be, you know, focused around the boys, didn't they?
She got together with Brian in 1965, and it is said that she brought out the rock star in Brian.
Right.
You know, he was already a snappy dresser. You can see from the pre-Anita photos, but once they got together,
Once she got her hands on him,
hell, you know, the floppy hats were just
as
the
we
beginning.
tend to do.
Yeah,
That shit. This is good.
There's
Wear
floppy
that.
hats and feather bows.
Have your hair like that. Right, we're good to go.
It was absolutely right, and Brian Jones was the first of his kind to be that kind of incredibly flamboyant dresser in the mid 60s, particularly. And you know, during this period, even though what we know was going on inside Brian and the drugs were just ramping up and the alcohol was ramping up, outwardly it was like, again, he was one of the most popular Stones, and he was certainly the physical portrayal of what the Stones were all about.
So at that point, they were maybe overshadowing Keith and Mick?
I certainly think that they were matching Keith and Mick in terms of their profile.
So they're Posh and Becks.
They were the original Posh and Becks before Posh and Becks were even born. And, you know, but there was a really dark side to their relationship as well. And I think this is something else that's going to come up in all of our podcasts. You know, it was a very difficult relationship. It was a tempestuous relationship. It was a crazy, volatile, passionate relationship fraught with intensity and punctuated by drink and drugs and loads of them. And so, you know, and there's a difficult thing that we need to talk about as well here, which is there have been many reports that their relationship included a large degree of physical abuse and domestic violence, like hitting and punching and shouting. And this is very much revisited in the documentary Catching Fire that I was talking about. It doesn't sound to me like there's any question that Brian got physical with Anita, that he would often be the one who struck the first blow, if not all of the time. And what is for sure is that Anita hit back. So, you know, she didn't just take it, she hit back. So there were a lot of physical fights, of which Brian was the perpetrator of domestic violence. So let's just name that. And let's also just say, for the record, that that is not acceptable under any circumstance. There's no excuse for it. He's accountable for those actions, no matter how troubled or unwell he was.
Fair.
But so theirs was a very strong and tempestuous relationship, and it ended in a very strong, tempestuous way with a massive betrayal.
Right.
Which basically saw Anita literally physically abandoning Brian, first when he was in hospital having had an asthma attack, and then secondly when they were on holiday in Morocco.
Right.
And she went off with Keith Richards.
Oh, man.
Which was obviously...
So more rejection.
Yeah, more rejection for Brian.
More
I mean,
abandonment.
great for Keith and Anita, and let's not take that away from them. And they went on to have a wonderful relationship. But at the time, more abandonment for Brian, because literally, once again, he found a suitcase on the doorstep.
It's never fun, is it, when you get dumped and they run off with someone you know, let alone someone in the same let alone one of your brothers, effectively, one of your family members.
Brother,
such a betrayal, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's harsh, isn't it?
Yeah, really, really harsh. And, you know, Brian was absolutely inconsolable. He hid it, or he tried to hide it.
And how old was Brian at this time when they split up?
I mean, we're talking 1967, and he was born in 1942, so he must have been 25.
So this is all happening so young, isn't it?
So anyway, with Brian, after this, you know, the drugs reached a new height and a new level. And by this stage, he was taking this really horrible drug called Mandrax, which not only, it's a downer, the Americans used to call it Quaaludes, and Mandrax, not only is it a downer, but it affects you physically. It can affect your physical coordination, and so Brian's playing started to suffer as well. It was just absolutely awful, and he was also still taking a lot of acid, and so combined with the loss of relationship, the loss of influence in the band, and the court case that we're just about to start talking about, it really was the beginning of the end for Brian. But again, let's look at the inner versus the outer here. In 1967, he introduced Jimi Hendrix on stage at the Monterey Jazz Festival.
Oh, wow.
Oh,
You know,
God.
he was still outwardly a rock star.
Oh, my God.
He was asked by the Beatles to go and record a track with him in Abbey Road.
Right.
You know,
I mean, it's crazy, isn't it? How your whole, like you said, the outer and the inner, how your entire inner world can be unraveling at pace. And yet what it looks like from the outside world is just incredible privilege and opportunity and wealth. And oh my God, look, they must be having such a good time.
Absolutely.
And what it looks like from the outside can have very, very little correlation to what actually is going on with somebody.
And Brian never talked about it. He always tried to put on a brave face. And, you know, so post 1967, it really didn't get any better for him, unfortunately. And his mental health really continued to decline. His last few years and sessions with the band were quite humiliating. It's said that they used to not even bother plugging his guitar in. And if you see him in some of the films that were made around that time, there's a film called Sympathy for the Devil by Jean-Luc Godard. And there's this awful, awful thing called Rock and Roll Circus. And I don't know what the fuck they were thinking when they made it. But they were like all dressed up in funny outfits. And I think it was sort of trying to be a bit like the Beatles, Get Back, Meet Sergeant Pepper, but it's terrible. But the most awful thing is Brian, and he looks bloated, he looks unhappy, he looks completely out of it. He's a disheveled wreck, and he seems to have lost his musical knowledge and ability.
So he's really in trouble at this point.
He was in the
really in
depths
trouble.
of his addictive disorder.
Yeah, and then to make matters worse, there was a whole drugs bust thing.
Yeah.
And you know, the drugs bust started in 1967, where basically the Stones got targeted, the Beatles got targeted too, by the police, and they wanted to get convictions for drug possession. Because really, they didn't like, the society, a lot of society didn't like what the Beatles and the Stones stood for.
And they're leading the young people down the path of immorality.
Astray, yes.
Exactly.
So it needs to be shut down.
Yeah. And so there was some famous drug busts. There was a lot of press. But actually, the person who got it the worst, Mick and Keith got most of the bad press. But, the person they really targeted was Brian, because he was in the worst condition. And so he was considered to be the easiest target. And there's at least 7 documented occasions when he got, pulled over, busted, house searched, whatever. And he was arrested twice, and he was convicted. He was the only member of the band at that time to have a lasting conviction. Other band members had convictions, but then they were overturned.
Yeah, so he couldn't get away with it.
And there was an awful lot of shame and fear. He was at one stage advised by his lawyers not to have any contact with any of the other band members and not to go home. So he was sofa surfing and isolated.
Can you imagine the paranoia?
And felt unsupported, yeah.
Yeah, it'd be terrible.
Yeah. Bob Dylan actually once said to him famously, "Hey, Brian, how's your paranoia today?" It's kind of like...
Says it all.
It was almost a standing joke that he was paranoid. And this was really like the icing on the cake. These legal issues. And when he got his second conviction, this was to be a massive, massive moment for his life in the Rolling Stones, because in 1968 they were planning a tour of America, and they found out that Brian couldn't go because he didn't have a visa.
Yeah, be able to get a visa.
Yeah.
So one fateful night in June 1969, I think, Mick and Keith and Bill and Charlie, to kind of ease the blow, went down to his house and told him that it was all over and that he was out the band, and literally left the proverbial suitcase on his doorstep.
Wow, for the third time. Yeah,
for the third time. And, what Brian said, he put on a brave face. He said, I no longer see eye to eye with the others over the discs we're cutting. We no longer communicate musically. The Stones' music is not to my taste anymore. And that was the end of Brian in the Rolling Stones.
Gosh.
Yeah.
It's big, yeah. That's...
Yeah. And then, 3 weeks later, having left the band or having been kicked out of the band, Brian was found dead in the swimming pool of his house after taking a lot of drink, a lot of downers, and his official death was death by drowning. There's a lot of theories as to how he died, but we don't want to discuss those now. This is not the time or the place. And, his death was a really, really tragic end to what had actually become a really, really tragic life for someone who was so full of life and opportunity and enthusiasm, and who arguably gave birth to one of the greatest bands of all time. And he was described more recently in a review of the amazing Nick Broomfield documentary. He was described by The Guardian as pop's ultimate fallen angel. And despite his many, many flaws, I think that's quite a good way to remember him.
It's such a shame that the law came after him when really it should have been a swathe of mental health professionals and people taking him to hospital because he's not fucking well, isn't it? And that still persists today, doesn't it? And actually what this lad, boy, child, 27, needed was someone to scoop him up and fucking look after him.
Completely agree. 100%. And and a lot of the Stones have now gone on record over the years as saying they just didn't know what to do with him.
But they're a bunch of other 27-year-old boys. How would they know?
And that's the problem, being stuck in the here and now without really being able to have the complete perception of everything that's come before and what's made him who he's become.
And by that stage as well, his behaviour was repellent, and so everybody was repelled by him, and he was isolated. Where in fact, what we know is that he was internally isolated, and what he really needed was compassion and help, as opposed to stigmatization and isolation.
Yeah.
So it's and it really kind of makes me think that I mean, you know, one of the real hopes for me in this podcast is the idea that, you know, by telling the stories of Brian in this instance, let's say, it really gives us an opportunity to talk about, you know, to speak to that idea of, you know, the deep misunderstanding that comes along with behaviours around addiction and mental health.
And to recognise the human in someone who may have been tarred with the brush of being the devil.
In this particular case, we're talking about the vicious cycle of addiction.
Yeah.
You know, and we're talking about addiction as something that is nobody chooses to become addicted.
It's a coping mechanism.
It's a coping mechanism in a lot of cases for earlier childhood stuff, childhood trauma, like we've discussed with Brian, potentially a coping mechanism for some of the symptoms of ADHD or other neurodiversities. And then, of course, a coping mechanism for the fame, the meteoric rise to fame that they experienced, and the identity issues that somebody in a rock band like that would have been experiencing, as well as the creative issues that Brian was having about having his musical baby taken away from him.
Which all connects back to the baby who was lost when he was a child, his sister.
My bottom line here is that Brian's story shouldn't be confused or misinterpreted as hedonism or narcissism or selfishness. It's a series of factors, from childhood trauma to his dysfunctional personality, his enabling environment, and the rock stardom, combined with a lack of care from the industry, because they just didn't know about it by then, that exacerbated it.
Really didn't stand a chance today, let's face it.
No, and, you know, sadly, it's still the case today in a lot of ways that the industry is still a very, very difficult place for people to, A, get recognised as being people who need help, and then B, people to get the help that they need. But thank God it's getting better.
Matt, that was, I mean, I don't know where you are with that.
Well, we need to leave him somewhere, don't we?
We do need to leave him somewhere. Well, that would be entirely down to you, I think.
So in this podcast, at the end of each episode, we're going to find somewhere suitable to leave the artist, so that they can be somewhere where we believe they would have been happy maybe before their difficulties really started.
When they were shining.
And so let's start with Brian, and we're going to leave him at the National Jazz and Blues Festival in Richmond Athletic Ground in August 1963. And this is where the Stones headlined, and it was a pure electric blues set. And an old friend of his, Jeff Keane, bumped into him. And Brian said to him, "This is my rhythm and blues band," with a beaming smile on his face, explaining to him that he'd found a group of like-minded people to play with and an audience that appreciated his beloved R&B without needing any traditional jazz numbers to keep them happy. And his friend said he was joyful rather than boastful, and he was in his element. And that's really where I'd like to leave Brian, up there on the stage playing his beloved electric blues with his rhythm and blues band, the Rolling Stones.
Oh,
cool.
That's lovely, Matt. That's lovely. So let's leave him there. There you go, Brian. Not just standard inside. Matt, I think are you a little bit teary?
I do feel a bit teary, actually.
I can see that. How are you feeling?
Yeah. Well, I've done a lot of research, as you might be able to tell, so I've really come to recognise myself in a lot of Brian's story, actually, and to recognise the, you know, as I said at the beginning, certainly the being misunderstood.
Well, you held him really well through the telling of his story.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was lovely. Thank you, Matt. So, every week on this podcast, we decided we were going to do something called One for the Road. And One for the Road is a recommendation that the person, in this instance, Matt, might have for us that may or may not be linked to the story. What is it, Matt?
Well, Sam, my One for the Road is a book.
Right.
And it is a book by a writer called Paul Trinker, and it's called Brian Jones, The Making of the Rolling Stones.
Okay.
I actually bought it twice because it's come out under two different titles. And among loads of other research that I've done, including watching the great Nick Broomfield documentary and Martin Scorsese's Crossfire Hurricane and David Hepworth's brilliant book, Uncommon People, this one is really good.
Lovely.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much. And what we're going to do each week is put the in the show notes, there'll be the link to the one for the road, because it's going to be different every week. And for people that have been interested in that episode, they might want to read some more, or look at the psychological theories that we're talking about, or just learn a bit more about what we've said.
Great.
That's all for this week. Thanks so much for listening.
We'll be back soon. And next week, we will be tackling the story of George Michael, the pop star that I grew up with and I still absolutely adore to this day.
We'll see you then.